Hello everyone and welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I am a certified yoga teacher, an ordained minister, kirtan artist, amongst other things. If you're interested in spirituality, metaphysics, spiritual concepts, chanting, you're in the right space. So please subscribe, and if you get something from the video, please like it, share, comment, and consider making a financial contribution, either one time through PayPal or Venmo, or joining my patrons on Patreon and making a monthly contribution. So today I wanted to speak a little bit about the dark night. I just recently have gone through a dark night of the soul. Maybe I'm not even through it, I'm not sure, but I certainly feel a lot better than I did. And dark nights are something I've spoken about in the past. It's nothing new. In my experience, we should expect them on a spiritual journey, even after enlightenment, even after a spiritual awakening. It's been said that enlightenment goes on forever, that there is no end to it. And so my suspicion is that this is true, and that we will bump up against the limitations of our ideas of self, what we call ego, in different forms as we grow and expand. So at first we might have a very limited sense of self, and our first awakening kind of does away with that conception. And for a while we experience this growth and expansion of our sense of self. We're much more than we conceived ourselves to be, and we enjoy that for a while. But then what we might find is we expand and then we hit another boundary, if you will, that the ego has created. Always a false boundary, but we believe it to be real, and thus we begin suffering again. And this has been my experience. And some people might say, well, then you're not fully enlightened or you're not fully awake. Maybe, but how can we be awake to something that we don't know is there, that's in the unconscious? This is the problem with the idea of, oh, I'm fully awake, I'm fully realized. We might believe this to be the case until we experience the next dark night. And in my experience, we don't get a warning of this. We don't get prior knowledge. Oh yeah, you're half baked, you're half done. I think the idea of proclaiming ourselves fully enlightened or completely clear or something of this nature is presumptuous, because we honestly don't know what we don't know. So even though as an individual we might feel that at this moment I'm clear of all blockages that I'm aware of, in the future I might find that another block existed as I again expanded, my sense of self expanded out, and it reached another barrier, if you will. So this is my experience of the dark night of the soul, this most recent one. I went through a long period of expansion, of approaching spirituality from a place of surrender, of not my will but thy will, God's will, letting go, allowing. And it brought me a lot of peace. It brought me a lot of joy. And it didn't bring me a very expansive life. So this is what I'll affectionately call the Buddhist approach. And I'm not trying to put down Buddhism. It's a wonderful path, beautiful path. But most paths are just that, they're paths. They are ways of understanding reality and working with reality. But I'm not sure that I'm convinced that any path contains every truth, that any path is quote unquote complete, fully complete, that there aren't things we can't learn from other traditions or other paths. So this Buddhist approach of surrender, letting go, dissolving self served me very, very well up until a few years ago. And then what I found is I hit up again against, I guess, certain conceptions that were not seen through in the ego. And it sent me into a dark night. Now, I have a lot of tools at my disposal as a teacher. So at this stage, I'm quite proficient at not collapsing into or spiraling into a deep depression or excessive anxiety. These are things I experienced before I had spirituality. Okay, so this is one of the great advantages of learning about spirituality, spiritual tools. They allow us to manage the ups and downs of life and even a spiritual life with a certain amount of grace and in a healthy, constructive way. They may not always bring us out of our dark night. I'll explain what's necessary to come out of the dark night in my experience. But what they can do is stabilize us and at least allow us to function, because some of these existential crises, if we don't have these tools, we might actually find that we become dysfunctional. We aren't able to work, we aren't able to sleep, we become antisocial perhaps, or maybe we dive into drugs, unhealthy community, we try and drown our sorrows in different ways. So for me personally, this recent dark night that I've gone through, and again, I've kind of come in and out of it, but I don't feel like I've really emerged from it until now. And again, I hope I'm not speaking prematurely. There could be more for me to experience. But what I found was, in order for me to emerge from the dark night, I had to expand my conception of self and understanding of the universe beyond what I had up until that point. So my teaching, my conception, my idea, they were somewhat limited. They, again, had served me and others very, very well. They lead to contentment. They lead to fulfillment. They lead to happiness. So there's, in a sense, nothing wrong with them. But again, if we look at the Buddhist path and kind of what Buddha was advocating for, my life was almost like a monk's life. I was sort of on my own. I would have partners or people who would kind of come and go, but I pretty much lived very solitary. And it wasn't a particularly expansive existence. It was kind of a small existence. Have my little apartment, my little car, my little business that I run. And again, absolutely nothing wrong with that, because it really fulfilled me. It really, really filled me up in a very, very profound way that is hard to explain. I think a lot of people might look at my life and think, well, he can't be very happy. Look at what he's got. But I was perfectly happy for a long time. But this is where the dark night came in. At a certain point in the last 3 or 4 years, starting really with the pandemic, that's what started this. And I was fine through the pandemic. I helped a lot of people. I didn't feel off kilter, but I think the pandemic was a global shift, if you want my honest opinion. I don't really think it had much to do with coronavirus ultimately. I think it was a global shift and an accelerant of what's going on this planet, for better or worse. I think it perhaps put the brake on certain things, but also accelerated other things and the development of certain things. So a lot of people I knew who maybe were headed toward divorce, they actually got divorced in that time. A lot of people who were headed in a certain direction, maybe starting their own business or quitting their job or something, it facilitated that. It kind of sped up that process. So again, I don't see the pandemic through the eyes of just oh, there's this awful virus that got released and we had to do this, that, and the other thing. I was seeing it much more from a spiritual context. So for me personally, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I wasn't thrown off kilter by that. I just started trying to support others as best as I could as a spiritual teacher and leader. And I felt still very fulfilled, very happy. But I had a series of shifts in relationships. My father died. I had a partnership that ended. I had another partnership that started and then ended. And it was a lot of loss. I spoke a little bit about this in my last video. Well, that either brought up or brought to light, or I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism was, but what ended up happening is I was no longer feeling the contentment and the joy and the peace that I experienced for a very, very long time prior to that. Over a decade of just really, really enjoying life and really feeling full of gratitude, and every moment was so full and so rich, and I was so happy. So what was happening, I think, was, again, I had perhaps been expanding, enjoying that freedom of the things that had been seen through. And then I hit up against something that had not yet been seen through in terms of egoic conception. And this is what's led me to manifestation, because what the type of manifestation that I am studying requires is a deeper level of acceptance of oneness. So it's taking a step beyond perhaps the connectedness that I had been aware of through the Buddhist approach, Buddhist practices, and it is taken that a step further. And until I was able to take that step, I didn't really feel any relief. I, again, had the tools and the understanding to weather the storm, but the storm wasn't lifting. And I think Buddhism might teach, well, just keep weathering the storm. Eventually it will lift. This too shall pass kind of approach. And that may very well work. At a certain point, perhaps it just would have dissipated on its own, or perhaps that approach comes to the same place that I've come through manifestation in a different way. But if it does, it seems like it's a slower path, a slower way of getting to the realization. So what I wanted to share with you today is, if you're experiencing a dark night, and I know that some of you are because you shared with me that you are, what I'd like you to look for is the place where the ego is still holding on. One of my teachers, Scott Killaby, he calls this Velcro thoughts. And he has one conception of it, but I'm even conceiving of it in a broader sense. Our self-identity, our self-conception, what we believe ourselves to be, how powerful we believe ourselves to be, the extent to which we are interconnected and influence others. These are areas that I had to explore and look at. And I'm still exploring and looking. I'm not saying by any means that I have completely finished this exploration, but the proof for me is really in the pudding. And I've been feeling a lot more like myself again. And oddly, it feels like a return to where I was before. But the way I'll describe spiritual development is it's circular, but it spirals. So if you think of the DNA helix, right, there's a spiraling. If you think of the Milky Way, there's a spiraling, right? We see this in a lot of things in nature and in the cosmos, the spiraling action. So what that signifies for us is, again, a return, but you're still not the same. And that's where I feel like I am now. I feel very much like my old self of surrendering and letting go, but I feel like I have a new conception and a new idea and a new realm to explore and to play with that will define the next chapter. And as I've done that, like I'm sharing, the dark night has lifted, that feeling of oppressiveness, of being cut off from source, from God, from true nature, that which is so painful to someone who's woken up spiritually. For someone who hasn't woken spiritually, they don't know the difference. So while they may be suffering every day of their life, they would call that quote unquote normal. And so in a sense, they may not label it as suffering. They don't even know that they're suffering. This is said in the Yoga Sutras, where people might actually call suffering joy. And I feel like you actually see this in some of the things that people do when they are not very awake. They do things that really are terrible for themselves and others, but they think they're having a good time. So when we have this awakening and we expand and we realize, we get the contrast of what really feeling good feels like, and we can contrast that, that's really the start, I think, when we have that experience. Many people experience that on retreat for the first time. They get a glimpse of another way, and then they come home, and the contrast is pretty stark, and they can't deny it anymore. They want back to that feeling, and they may associate that with retreat, but actually it's not in the retreat. Or they associate with a teacher or a class or teaching. It's not in any of those things. It's in you. What the teacher or the class or retreat did was created a space where you felt safe to experience that side of yourself, to let go enough. And this is really what yoga is about. So once we experience that, we can then start the process of letting go of the egoic limitations. Most people, it's going to be a process, and for most people, it will be a lengthy process, but it's a joyful one. It's one that every victory really leads to more peace, more joy, more bliss. But then we hit these dark nights, like the one that I've just been through. And again, in my experience, a dark night is a deeper level of self-conception and understanding. And we emerge from it when we've seen what we need to see, when we've truly grokked this new realization. That's my experience anyway, at least with this latest one. And so I would invite you, if you're experiencing a dark night, to explore this conception. What is your conception of self? What are the limits? And how could you perhaps explore letting go of that? I shared in my last video about giving others and yourself what it is that you really need. And I think this is a great example of what I'm talking about. Most of us think that there is a separation between ourselves and others, and that if we give something to somebody else, it's not going to have any impact on me. If I need love and I love someone else, I still need love. And we also might think that love exists outside of us. I need someone else to give me love. I can't give myself love. That doesn't make any sense. I need to get love. So this is an example. If you are someone who's suffering because of this kind of a conception, and many of us have it on an unconscious level. We may not realize how it's functioning, and that's really very, very important in getting deeper into spirituality. And like I said, my teacher, Scott Killaby, he really has taken a deep dive in this direction where the unconscious beliefs are really coloring our experience of reality. And that's, again, what led me to manifestation. For me, manifestation is another approach to dealing with these problems of self-conception, self-identity, and the way they show up for us, even after spiritual awakening, even after quote-unquote enlightenment. Now, different people have different definitions of enlightenment. That's fine. I'm not really interested in debating it. I'll use these terms how I like to use them. Again, is there some kind of complete enlightenment? Some people say that there is, but again, we only know what we know. So that might be complete as far as I'm concerned, but there might be some bigger cosmic complete. So I'm not really that interested in debating those things. Once we're spiritually awake, this path unfolds in front of us, you could say, and then we are invited to walk it. And how well we walk it, how quickly we walk it, how much we stumble, how often we get lost, this is very much in our hands and how we handle and deal with that process. Some people walk a very straight, quick path, others meander, others get lost completely, seemingly. Although, as my teacher, one of my teachers once said, you can't leave the Dharma. And I believe that's true. You really can't step off of this path. I believe it was Trungpa Rinpoche who said, don't step on the spiritual path because you can't get off of it. So once you're on, you might be playing around with spirituality. You might think it's cool or neat. You may not really want to dissolve your ego, but once you really get on this path, it really drives itself forward without much permission from you. So, if you are experiencing a dark night, my recommendation is look into your self-conception and the limits of what you think is possible for you in the world. Try and look at your beliefs about yourself and how those beliefs might be limiting you in your experience. Spend time being quiet. So as I said earlier, you may need to do certain things to manage, and that's important and it's good. This is where these spiritual tools can really be a lifesaver. We don't want to collapse in a pool of misery. That won't do many people any good. But we do want to consciously take time to be still and to know. One of my favorite passages from the Bible is, "Be still and know I am God." Okay, to me, that passage is so, so, so powerful. So it starts with, again, be still and know I am God. Okay, maybe I'll do a talk on that passage at some point, but just know that I think that that is key. We can go out with friends, we can do yoga practices, we can go on a retreat, we can talk to a teacher, we can do activities to make sure we don't sink into or spiral into a depression or depressive state or a real spiritual crisis. But outside of that, what we want to do is take time to really be present with the feelings and figure out, what are they saying about me? What does this mean about me, my conception of myself? And if you're not sure how to do that, reach out to me. We can set up a one-on-one session, private session, and I might be able to help guide you through that process, okay? So once we see through the erroneous limitation, like Byron Katie says, we only ever suffer because we're believing something that ultimately isn't true. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, I have talks about relative versus ultimate truth. They are not the same thing. Facts versus truth. So there might be certain facts, but that's not what causes us to suffer. What causes us to suffer is our interpretation of facts, our judgment. And as A Course in Miracles so forcefully states, we cannot judge. It's not that we shouldn't judge, it's that we just don't have the tools. We don't really have the capacity. And so in my experience, the suffering, even in the dark night, will come from judgment on some level. It may be completely unconscious. And that's where getting still and diving into the unconscious with inquiry and meditation is important. Changing unconscious beliefs, again, can be done with something like sankalpa, which is a yogic form of manifestation. Of course, there are other ways of working with manifestation. I hope to cover some of these in the future. But for now, sankalpa is a tried and true yogic technique. There are yoga nidras I have on this channel, on my Patreon page. I have for sale. I do them every week in classes. So lots of opportunities. There's also yoga nidras all over the internet. So this is a tool that we can start using right away to change our self-conception, or even to uncover our self-conception, because I could create a sankalpa. I want to know what is in my way, or I want to know what is blocking me, or I want to be free to expand, something like this. However we conceive of our sankalpa. All right, so I hope this was helpful for you. If you got something from it, again, consider liking, subscribing, sharing, commenting. All those things help with the algorithm on YouTube. And if you feel moved to do so, consider making a financial contribution, as that's really what allows me to continue to make these talks. Until next time, everybody, namaste, and have a beautiful, beautiful day.